Have you ever wondered how something so safe could go terribly wrong? Imagine a massive industrial facility where everything is designed with the latest technology, built to withstand any disaster at least. That's what they said. The totally safe storage tank was supposed to be the epitome of industrial safety. It was carefully constructed, inspected, and approved by experts. Engineers believed it could handle everything until one fateful day. It didn't. What was meant to be a marvel of modern engineering turned into a ticking time bomb. This tank, located in a high-stakes environment, was designed to store molten iron at high temperatures, an essential part of the steel production process. The storage tank was supposed to be a fail-safe, an innovation that would prevent any potential accidents. But something went horribly wrong, and it turned out that the tank wasn't as safe as everyone thought. At the heart of the disaster was the belief in overconfidence, a blind trust in technology, and a fundamental failure to understand the dangers lurking beneath the surface. For years, the workers and engineers at the facility had been assured by their superiors that their storage system was foolproof. They worked in the shadow of this illusion of safety, unaware that one small failure could lead to an unimaginable catastrophe. So, what went wrong? How did a supposedly safe system become a deadly force? To answer that, we need to look deeper into the incident, a chain of events, the overlooked risks, and the people involved. It all starts with that one pivotal moment when everything that seemed so secure wasn't. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what could have been the cause of this disaster. Hit that like button if you want more stories about the hidden dangers in industrial history, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's move on and dive deeper into the chain of events leading up to this deadly explosion. Don't imagine the scene inside this industrial facility, an intricate maze of pipes, tanks, and machines, all working in unison to produce molten iron at blistering temperatures. At first glance, everything seemed perfect. The workers moved efficiently, their daily tasks dictated by a strict protocol, overseen by supervisors who had full confidence in their systems. The storage tank that stood in the heart of this facility was the pinnacle of industrial design, holding molten iron for processing, ready to fuel the furnace for the next batch of steel. Behind the scenes, however, there were cracks in the seemingly flawless facade. Engineers had raised concerns about the structural integrity of certain components, but these warnings were brushed aside. The tank was touted as the most advanced in its class, designed to last for decades without issue. The company's reputation for safety first made everyone feel at ease. After all, what could go wrong with a tank built to handle thousands of tons of molten metal? The workers had no reason to question this belief. They trusted their equipment, followed procedures, and believed the promises made by the company. But there were small, almost imperceptible signs that began to surface, things that, in hindsight, were the telltale signs of a disaster waiting to happen. From small leaks to minor pressure discrepancies, these overlooked issues slowly began to stack up. And yet, the facility continued running full steam ahead, pushing production limits. The company's executives reassured everyone the tank was designed to withstand far more pressure than it was under. It was foolproof, they insisted. It was only a matter of time before that false sense of security would meet its breaking point. As the production line hummed along, few questioned the integrity of the very system designed to protect them. No one noticed the small, seemingly insignificant flaws that would later become crucial factors. The workers continued with their tasks, the engineers kept their eyes on the bigger picture, and the storage tank stood as a monument to technological pride, aware that one minor miscalculation was all it would take to trigger an unimaginable chain reaction. The moment that would change everything began with an unsettling sound, airy creak, that echoed through the facility. But by then, the damage had already been done. The safe storage tank, designed to withstand extreme pressure and temperature, had been pushed too far. Years of constant use, combined with unnoticed flaws in its construction and the careless disregard for small safety issues, had set the stage for disaster. What exactly went wrong? It wasn't a single failure, it was a perfect storm of technical mishaps, human error, and systemic oversight that led to the catastrophic explosion. First, let's take a closer look at the structural design of the tank. The tank was built to handle molten iron at incredibly high temperatures, up to 1500 grados to 700 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that would melt steel, But underneath all the advanced engineering, there were weak points that no one had anticipated. The design of the storage tank involved a complex system of valves, pressure regulators, and reinforcement beams. While these components had passed initial safety inspections, wear and tear over the years had taken a toll. One critical valve, meant to regulate pressure, had been malfunctioning for months. The pressure had been building inside the tank at a dangerous rate, but because the symptoms were subtle, they were dismissed as normal fluctuations. And then there was the tank's base. Despite being built on solid ground, years of heavy use had created a slight tilt in the structure. It was a small issue, so small, in fact, that no one thought it warranted attention. But as pressure continued to mount, the tilt caused the molten iron to shift unevenly, adding stress to the already fragile components. In hindsight, it's easy to see that these small, seemingly insignificant issues were all the warning signs of a much bigger problem. The engineers had overlooked these minor flaws, believing they were within acceptable limits. The human error came into play when safety checks were either rushed or ignored altogether. Workers continued to operate the system as usual, unaware of the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface. As the pressure inside the tank reached its critical threshold, it was no longer a matter of if, but when. When the explosion finally occurred, it didn't just rupture the tank, it sent a 2,300-ton blast of molten iron into the air, raining down on everything in its path. The destruction was instant and complete. At 2:17 p.m. on that fateful day, the tension in the air was palpable. Inside the control room, the engineers were reviewing data, unaware that they were moments away from witnessing a catastrophic event that would change everything. The molten iron was flowing, the valves were in place, and the pressure was building steadily. But something was about to give, something that had been overlooked for far too long. The first sign of trouble came when the pressure regulator gave an unexpected reading. It fluctuated wildly, then stabilized. But this wasn't a normal fluctuation. It was a sign that the system was struggling to cope with the demand being placed on it. The temperature inside the storage tank was rising faster than anyone had anticipated, and the pressure continued to build. Workers in the area were becoming more aware of a strange vibration that seemed to pulse through the floor. As the minutes passed, an uneasy feeling began to settle over the plant. The workers, who had grown accustomed to the noise and the heat of the molten iron, could no longer ignore the abnormal vibrations coming from the tank. A few even stopped to glance nervously at the control room windows, but by then, it was already too late. And then, the unthinkable happened. Without warning, the storage tank ruptured. It wasn't a slow, controlled failure. It was a violent, explosive force that sent shockwaves through the entire facility. The sound was deafening, like the roar of 1,000 thunderclaps rolled into one. The tank exploded with such force that the very earth seemed to shake beneath it. Molten iron, red-hot and glowing, was launched high into the sky in an explosive burst of metal and fire. The fireball reached hundreds of feet into the air, casting a terrifying glow over the entire area. Workers who were in close proximity had no time to react. The blast was so sudden and overwhelming that there was no escape. Those who weren't hit by the molten iron were trapped in the ensuing chaos, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Buildings were flattened, and the surrounding equipment was destroyed in an instant. What was supposed to be an impenetrable fortress of safety had become a deadly furnace of destruction. As the debris rained down and the dust settled, the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. It wasn't just an industrial accident, it was a disaster of catastrophic proportions. The fire continued to burn for hours, and the molten iron caused further damage as it spread across the facility. The air was thick with smoke and toxic fumes, making it nearly impossible to breathe. In the aftermath, the extent of the devastation became clear. Lives had been lost, the plant was in ruins, and the damage to the surrounding environment was irreparable. What was supposed to be a totally safe system had failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The moment the explosion occurred, it wasn't just an industrial disaster, it was a scene of absolute devastation. What was once a busy, bustling facility had been reduced to ruins in a matter of seconds. The force of the explosion sent shockwaves through the plant, obliterating everything in its path. The sound of the blast echoed for miles, a terrifying reminder of the violent eruption that had just taken place. The immediate area surrounding the storage tank was the hardest hit. Molten iron, weighing over 2,300 tons, had shot into the sky with terrifying speed, raining down on anything within a vast radius. Structures were flattened in an instant, and what was left of the equipment was either scorched or melted beyond recognition. Steel beams twisted like pretzels, and concrete foundations were shattered. What had once been a cutting-edge industrial site was now a charred wasteland, but the destruction wasn't confined to the facility alone. The explosion sent debris flying for miles, tearing through nearby buildings, vehicles, and infrastructure. What was left of the molten metal caused fires that continued to burn for hours, some of them dangerously close to other fuel supplies and chemicals stored nearby. It was only a matter of time before these fires began to spread, threatening to cause even more widespread damage. As emergency crews rushed to the site, the magnitude of the disaster became apparent. First responders were met with scenes of chaos, burning wreckage, broken bodies, and cries for help. The heat from the molten iron was so intense that it felt like a blast furnace had descended upon the area, and the air, thick with smoke, made it difficult for anyone to see more than a few feet in front of them. The scale of the destruction was staggering. In the aftermath, it was reported that several blocks of the surrounding area had been affected, with buildings collapsing under the weight of the blast or catching fire from the molten debris. Emergency services were stretched thin, and it took hours if not days for the full extent of the damage to be assessed. There was no escaping the overwhelming reality that this wasn't just a local disaster. It was a tragedy that would echo through the community for years to come. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the destruction was the loss of life. Workers who had been in close proximity to the explosion were caught in its deadly radius. Many were killed instantly by the blast or by falling debris. The hospital wards were quickly filled with the injured burn victims, those with broken bones, and people suffocating from smoke inhalation. It was impossible to ignore the human cost of such a catastrophic failure. As the hours passed and the fires were finally contained, the true scope of the disaster was laid bare. The plant was rendered completely unusable, and the surrounding area was left in ruins. The community was shaken, not just by the loss of property, but by the emotional toll it took on everyone involved. Families, co-workers, and friends, many of whom had worked side by side for years, were now faced with an overwhelming sense of grief and loss. In the wake of the explosion, the search for answers began almost immediately. The destruction was so immense that it left no room for uncertainty. The facility was in ruins, workers had lost their lives, and the financial repercussions were staggering. But as investigators began to sift through the rubble, it wasn't just the physical damage they had to address. The most important question on everyone's mind was, who was to blame? The company, which had been proud of its state-of-the-art safety measures, immediately began an internal investigation. On paper, they had done everything right. The engineers had followed strict guidelines, the tank had been inspected regularly, and the safety protocols were in place, or so they thought. However, as the investigation unfolded, cracks began to appear in their supposed safety practices. First, the design of the tank was called into question. Engineers had worked hard on making it resistant to pressure and heat, but they had overlooked certain fundamental design flaws. The tank was more than capable of holding molten iron, but under extreme pressure and heat, the structural weaknesses were exposed. The pressure valves, though well maintained, had been operating at the edge of their capacity. One small malfunction or a minor human error could easily tip the scales. As the investigation continued, it became apparent that the design flaws were not the only culprits. Negligence also played a significant role. The workers and engineers had failed to address subtle signs of trouble: minor leaks, fluctuating pressure levels, and equipment malfunctions. While these issues were typically seen as nothing more than routine maintenance, they were symptoms of a much deeper problem. The failure to investigate these issues thoroughly left the tank vulnerable to catastrophic failure. But the blame didn't fall solely on the engineers and the company. Human error played a significant role as well. The workers had followed standard procedures, but the high-stress environment and pressure to maintain production led many to overlook small safety checks. The desire to keep the plant running smoothly at all costs had led to corners being cut. Some workers even reported feeling rushed during their shifts, leading to hurried inspections and rushed maintenance. And then there was the corporate culture. The company, focused on maximizing production, had fostered an atmosphere where safety was an afterthought. Managers, under pressure to meet quotas and deadlines, had prioritized output over safety concerns. Internal audits were often completed hastily, and safety violations were overlooked to avoid disrupting operations. In the end, the system that had promised safety was built on the very same foundation of greed and negligence. As the public learned more about the disaster, the company was thrust into the spotlight. Lawsuits followed, along with public outrage. Workers and families of those killed in the explosion demanded justice, and the company's once stellar reputation quickly crumbled. The disaster was a turning point not just for the company, but for the entire industry. The truth became clear. No amount of safety assurances could compensate for the lack of true accountability. But even in the face of such a monumental failure, the company continued to deflect blame. Their executives blamed the engineers for not catching the issues sooner, while the engineers pointed to the company for imposing unrealistic production demands. Workers, meanwhile, blamed the whole system, arguing that it had failed to protect them from the dangers inherent in their jobs. In the end, who was truly responsible? Was it the engineers for their design flaws, the workers for their oversight, or the company for prioritizing profit over safety? The lines between blame were blurred, and the answers weren't easy to find. In the wake of the explosion, the most devastating consequence was not just the destruction of equipment or the financial losses, it was the human toll. Behind the cold statistics of damage and destruction were real people, workers, families, and a community that would never be the same. The tragedy was not just about the shattered steel and torn concrete. It was about the lives lost, the families forever changed, and the survivors left to pick up the pieces. The workers at the plant had been part of a close-knit community. Many had spent years, even decades, working alongside one another. They had celebrated milestones, faced challenges, and endured the grueling demands of industrial work together. But in the span of a few moments, that camaraderie was torn apart. Colleagues became casualties, and the workers, who had once felt safe in the facility, were suddenly faced with an unimaginable nightmare. The first responders, too, were affected. Emergency teams arrived on the scene as the fires still raged, the air thick with toxic fumes. They found themselves not just battling flames and searching for survivors, but also trying to comprehend the scale of the destruction. The sight of molten iron, still burning on the ground, was a grim reminder of the horrors that had unfolded. Many of the first responders were veterans of disaster relief, but even they were struck by the magnitude of the devastation. The emotional scars left on those who survived were just as profound. For the workers who managed to escape, the memory of the blast would haunt them forever. Those who were fortunate enough to leave the facility before the explosion struck often felt guilt for having made it out when so many others did not. In interviews after the disaster, survivors spoke of the sounds of the explosion, the shouts for help, and the desperate scramble to find safety. These memories, too, would linger long after the physical destruction had been cleared away. Families of the deceased were left grappling with the loss of their loved ones. Many workers were the primary earners for their households, and their sudden deaths left their families in a state of shock and financial instability. Widows, children, and parents of the victims had to navigate a life without their breadwinners, while also dealing with the profound emotional impact of losing someone so suddenly. In the aftermath, memorials were held for the workers who had died. The names of the victims were etched into plaques, and moments of silence were observed in honor of those who had been taken too soon. The community came together in grief, but there was also a sense of anger over the fact that lives had been lost due to preventable errors. Workers' unions rallied, demanding accountability, but the scars left by the tragedy were not something that could easily be erased by legal action or public outcry. For the surviving workers, many of whom had lost friends and colleagues, the path forward was uncertain. Some left the industry altogether, unable to bear the weight of the memory. Others returned to work, but they were forever changed. The sense of safety they once had was shattered, and the trust in the company that had promised them security was gone. No amount of safety protocols could bring back what was lost. And then there were the children of the victims, some of whom were too young to even understand what had happened. They would grow up without fathers or mothers, with a hole in their lives that could never be filled. The emotional scars left on the families would be passed down through generations, as they carried the weight of the tragedy with them. The human cost of this disaster was immeasurable, and as the months and years passed, it became clear that the emotional and psychological aftermath would be just as long-lasting as the physical destruction. For many, the pain would never truly go away. The aftermath of the explosion not only left behind a devastated community, but also a complex web of legal challenges. The company's reputation, once untouchable, was now in ruins. As public outrage mounted and investigations began, the focus shifted to accountability. Who would bear the responsibility for such a catastrophic failure? In the weeks following the disaster, a formal investigation was launched. Government safety agencies, along with independent investigators, descended on the site to determine what went wrong. The initial findings were damning. The company had followed safety regulations, yes, but they had also cut corners. Pressure to meet deadlines and maximize profits had led to repeated neglect of safety concerns. Minor malfunctions were ignored, and the flawed design of the tank had never been fully addressed. The first legal challenge came in the form of lawsuits from the families of the victims. They demanded justice, compensation, and a public apology, and they weren't alone. Workers' unions rallied behind the families, pushing for the company to be held accountable for the loss of life. The company, meanwhile, tried to deflect blame, focusing on the human error and the workers' failure to properly follow safety protocols. As the lawsuits piled up, the company tried to avoid responsibility, arguing that the disaster was caused by a freak series of events that could not have been predicted. But the public was not so easily swayed. The media, once supportive of the company's promises of safety, turned against them, painting the executives as greedy and negligent. Articles, interviews, and exposes revealed the company's deep-rooted culture of cost-cutting and complacency. The more the public learned, the harder it became for the company to defend itself. The courts were slow to move, but eventually, several key figures in the company faced criminal charges for their roles in the disaster. The company's CEO, who had once been seen as a visionary leader, was brought to trial for negligence and reckless endangerment. Though the CEO's defense team argued that the explosion was an unforeseeable accident, the court found the company guilty of failing to implement proper safety measures, ultimately sentencing the CEO to a lengthy prison term. Meanwhile, the engineers who had been directly involved in the design and maintenance of the tank faced civil suits for their role in the explosion. The courts found that the engineers had been negligent in their duties, failing to act on clear signs of danger. While the engineers did not face criminal charges, they were held financially responsible for the damages and ordered to pay hefty fines and restitution to the victims' families. But the legal consequences didn't stop with the company and its employees. The industry as a whole began to face increased scrutiny. Regulatory bodies, once criticized for being too lenient, responded by overhauling safety regulations. They introduced new guidelines for the construction and maintenance of industrial tanks, placing stricter limits on pressure levels, materials, and design specifications. No longer could companies rely on outdated practices or ignore minor issues now. They were forced to adopt more stringent measures to protect workers. The explosion had sparked a wider conversation about corporate accountability, worker safety, and the role of government oversight in preventing such disasters. The industry would never be the same, but the question remained, would these changes be enough to prevent future disasters? The disaster that unfolded in the wake of the explosion was a wake-up call for the entire industrial sector. What had once been seen as an isolated event was quickly recognized as a symptom of a much larger issue, the systemic failure to prioritize safety in the rush for profit. As the company faced public outrage and legal repercussions, the ripple effect reached far beyond the plant itself. This catastrophe prompted a sweeping re-evaluation of industrial safety standards across the globe. In the months following the explosion, government agencies and industry leaders came together to examine what had gone wrong and how they could prevent something similar from happening again. The failure of the storage tank, a piece of equipment that had been touted as safe for decades, exposed a critical gap in safety oversight. The industry had relied on outdated regulations and practices, believing that technological advances would solve any potential problems. But the explosion showed that technology alone could not replace rigorous safety protocols and constant vigilance. One of the most significant changes came in the form of new regulations governing the design and maintenance of industrial tanks. Pressure limits were redefined, and tanks had to undergo more frequent inspections to ensure they could withstand the demands placed upon them. These inspections no longer focused solely on the exterior of the tanks. Now, they had to include more detailed assessments of internal components, things that had previously been overlooked. Valves, pressure regulators, and support beams that had once been deemed sufficient were now held to much higher standards. The explosion also led to the introduction of stricter regulations on worker safety. Where before, workers had been given little more than basic training on emergency procedures, new programs were implemented that required extensive education on how to identify risks and handle dangerous situations. Emergency response drills were now mandatory, and employees were trained to recognize the early signs of malfunction in equipment. The company, which had once pushed workers to meet tight deadlines at all costs, now faced mounting pressure to ensure that safety was never compromised in the name of productivity. Safety audits became a regular feature of industrial operations. These audits were more thorough, and they didn't just rely on the company's internal assessments. Independent inspectors, tasked with scrutinizing every aspect of the operation, were given the authority to halt production if safety standards were not met. The idea was simple: if a company couldn't prove its safety procedures were foolproof, it wouldn't be allowed to operate. In addition to physical safety regulations, the industry took a closer look at corporate culture and accountability. The explosion highlighted how a focus on profits over safety could lead to devastating consequences. In response, companies were required to implement stronger safety management systems. These systems ensured that safety was not only a priority in the design and operation of equipment, but also embedded in the very fabric of the company's ethos. The government also pushed for long-term monitoring of industrial sites. Safety records were now available to the public, allowing communities to see for themselves whether companies were adhering to regulations. Companies that failed to meet safety standards faced severe penalties, including the suspension of operations, which became a powerful incentive for change. As the industry adapted to the new regulations, it was clear that while the changes were significant, the true test would be whether they would be maintained in the long run. Would the industry continue to evolve, or would complacency return once the memory of the explosion began to fade? The changes that followed the disaster were only the beginning of a larger cultural shift towards safety, a shift that would hopefully prevent another catastrophe like the one that had claimed so many lives. The explosion that rocked the facility and caused widespread devastation left more than just physical damage. It left a profound legacy that would echo throughout the industry for years to come. The disaster changed the way companies approached safety, forcing a rethinking of everything from design to operations to corporate culture. But even as the industry adapted and regulations evolved, the memory of the disaster remained. A stark reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control when corners were cut in the name of profit. One of the most lasting legacies of the explosion was the heightened awareness of industrial safety. Where once safety was seen as an afterthought or a box to check, it now became the central concern of every worker, engineer, and executive. The idea that accidents could happen at any time, even in the most foolproof of systems, was now ingrained in the collective consciousness of the industrial sector. As a result, industries worldwide began to invest heavily in safety technology and training. It wasn't just about meeting regulatory standards anymore. Companies realized that ensuring the safety of their workers was crucial to maintaining operations and their public image. Safety innovation became a priority. From pressure sensors and advanced valve systems to real-time monitoring and predictive maintenance software, technology played a pivotal role in the new era of industrial safety. Beyond the technical changes, the explosion also served as a powerful reminder of the human cost of industrial disasters. The tragedy left deep scars not only on the survivors but also on the families of the victims and the wider community. Many of those who lost loved ones or were affected by the blast carried the emotional weight of the disaster for the rest of their lives. The human impact was immeasurable, and it spurred communities to demand better protections for workers, ensuring that those who risked their lives every day in dangerous industries would never be forgotten. Perhaps one of the most important legacies was the shift in corporate accountability. The legal battles that followed the explosion not only brought justice to the families but also established a new standard for how companies were held responsible for their failures. No longer could corporations hide behind vague assurances or outdated safety measures. Public pressure and legal precedents forced companies to be transparent, to own their mistakes, and to invest in long-term solutions to ensure the safety of their employees. This disaster became a symbol, one that was taught in safety training courses around the world as a critical case study. It became a touchstone for those working in high-risk industries, a reminder of how easily a minor flaw or a neglected safety check could lead to catastrophic consequences. And while regulations and safety standards had improved, the question always lingered: had enough truly been done to ensure that this kind of disaster would never happen again? As the years passed, the disaster faded from the headlines, but it never fully left the collective memory. Every new regulation, every safety innovation, was built upon the painful lessons learned from the tragedy. While the company involved may have slowly recovered, the community and the families of the victims never fully healed. For them, the explosion was not just a moment in time, it was a life-altering event that would shape their futures forever. Even now, when industrial disasters occur, people look back at this event as a cautionary tale, a reminder that safety, while often taken for granted, is never something to be complacent about. It is a legacy that lives on not just in the regulations and the new safety measures, but in the very way the industrial world approaches the delicate balance between progress and protection. If this legacy of safety and accountability resonates with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think industries today can still learn from this disaster? If you're interested in more stories like this, be sure to like, subscribe, and watch the next video on the screen for more tales of industrial transformations and tragedies.